Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamualaikum and hello everyone. Welcome to Unit 1 of FAST 5043. My lecture today will be discussing about introductions to risk assessment. In this unit, you will learn about what is risk assessment, as well as the concept of risk assessment. What is risk assessment? Risk assessment is a process of gathering information on toxic effects of chemical. These first steps of risk assessment is to understand the potential hazards posed by chemicals to human health and the environment. The sources of information can be gathered from scientific studies, material safety datasheets, industry reports, regulatory agencies, and toxicological databases. For example, information may include specific effects on organs such as liver and kidneys, carcinogenicity, mutagenicity, and reproductive toxicity. Once data on toxic effects is collected, it is essential to evaluate the likelihood and the severity of exposure-related risks. Risk assessment models such as hazards identifications, dose response assessments, and exposure assessments can be used for this purpose. The durations and intensity of exposure. Susceptible populations such as pregnant women and children, environmental conditions are factors to be considered. This process helps determine safe exposure levels, establish regulatory guidelines, and decides on necessary safety measures such as PPE, ventilations, and safe handling protocols. For example, assessing risks from chemical used in industrial processes, consumer products, or agriculture use. So let's explore the definition of risk. Risk can be defined as the potential for harm to occur based on two key factors: the likelihood, which is the probability of an event happening, and is the severity of or the consequences of that event if it does occur. For example, in a chemical plant, the risk of a hazardous chemical spill might be low, which is low probability. But if the spills occur, the consequences could be catastrophic, which is high consequences, resulting in a high overall risk. So these combinations helps organizations prioritize risks and allocate resources to mitigate the most significant ones. So what is the difference between hazards and risks? A hazard is any source or situations with the potential to cause harm. It is an inherent characteristic of a substance, activity, or processes. For example, a toxic chemical or a moving machine parts are both hazards, as they have a potential to cause harm. So how about risk? Risk, on the other hand, is the probability that harm will occur and the extent of that harm if it does. Risk assesses the likelihood and impact of harm resulting from exposure to a hazard. For example, the risk of being injured by moving machine parts depends on how often the machine operates, which is the probability, and how severe an injury would be if a worker were caught which is the consequences. So what are the steps for risk assessment process? The risk assessment process consisted of 5 steps, which are: the first one is hazards identifications, followed by the second step, hazards characterizations or evaluations, or dose response assessments, followed by exposure assessments. The fourth step is risk characterizations, and the last step, risk communications. So for these steps, you will learn further in the next unit of this course. So the figure shows the complete procedure of chemical risk assessments under REACH. Risk assessment process starts with steps 1, which consists of info gathering and evaluations of parameters such as intrinsic properties, operational conditions, and risk management. Followed by second step, which is hazards characterizations, which detail out hazards classifications, dose response characterizations, as well as PNEC derivations. The third step is exposure assessments, where exposure levels are estimated, followed by step 4, risk characterizations, where risk levels are characterized. So the final steps is documenting the assessment reports, where the risk is communicated to the public and relevant authorities. So there are several types of risk assessments, depending on the nature of the risk that we are evaluating. However, for these subjects, we are focusing on 2 types of risk assessments, which are health and safety risk assessments and environmental risk assessments. For the first one, the focus is to ensure the employee and public safety within the workplace or public spaces. So the key goals are to identify hazards, evaluating risks, and implementing safety measures. Examples for this type of risks are workplace safety in manufacturing, such as the risk of machinery accidents, chemical exposure, and so on. The second example is evaluating the potential for slip, trips, and falls in office environments, as well as safety protocols in the construction industry. So for the second risk is environmental risk assessments. So the focus is to assess the potential environmental impacts of activities or projects, and the key goals of this type of risk is to minimize negative effects on ecosystems, water, air quality, and biodiversity. Examples for this type of risk are assessing the environmental impact of constructions, such as air and water pollutions and habitat disruptions. The second example is evaluating pollution from industrial activities and waste management practices. The another example is risk related to climate change, such as sea level rise or extreme weather events. These are 2 examples of case study for risk assessment in practices. So for case study 1, workplace safety in a manufacturing environment. So this case study emphasized the importance of protecting employees and visitors in manufacturing environments, where hazards like machinery, chemicals, and physical risks are prevalent. For example, hazardous chemicals such as solvents, acids, or gases pose risk of exposure through inhalations, skin contact, or accidental injections. Therefore, risk analysis should be carried out, and safety measures such as engineering control, using personal protective equipment (PPE), training and procedure, and emergency protocol should be established within the workplace premises. For case study 2, environmental impact for oil spill risk assessments. So this case study explains the significance of assessing environmental risks, especially for high-impact industries like oil and gas, where accidents like oil spills can cause long-lasting damage to ecosystems. The primary hazards from oil spills can harm marine life, including fish, birds, and mammals, and damage ecosystems like wetlands and coral reefs. Therefore, in the case of a proposed offshore oil drilling operations, an environmental risk assessment would include the analysis of potential oil spill scenarios, followed by measures to minimize environmental harms, such as enhanced safety protocols and response equipments. Thank you for listening, and see you in the next chapter. Thank you.